Our speaker today is Dr. Jeremy Walsh. Jeremy is an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University. He completed both his Master of Science and PhD at Queen's University before carrying out a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of British Columbia. His research is focused on investigating the mechanisms by which daily behaviors, such as physical activity, diet, screen time, sleep, and cognitive stimulation impact brain function. Jeremy and his research team are particularly interested in characterizing the impacts of these behaviors on the neuroactive hormone brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, cerebral blood flow, and cerebrovascular function and cognition. The overarching goal of his research is to apply this knowledge to develop interventions that optimize brain health in middle to older aged adults. Dr. Walsh will be sharing insights and tips about the grant writing process from his perspective as an early career researcher. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Walsh.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I think we covered the first 5 or 6 slides on presentation. So I appreciate that, Jazine. No, it's great. It's a great introduction. So my name is Jeremy Walsh, and I'm an assistant prof in Kin. My pronouns are he, him. And today is not going to be a comprehensive, list of all the different things I can provide you with in terms of tips from an ECR perspective. But I was really trying to distill some of the main takeaways that I've had in my grant writing experience to date. And I'd also invite and encourage you to share your perspective as well throughout. So to kick off with a land acknowledgement, just to maybe feed off of what Jazine said, Hamilton is my new home, and I've had the immense pleasure of being able to discover and explore this land through the Dundas Valley Trail System and Coots Paradise as well. It's been such an honor to discover this land, but I do recognize that my role as a guest to be a steward of this land, and also the responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that the Indigenous people share with this land. So for today's presentation, I'm going to break it down into, 3 different sections. To start, I'm going to give you my background and experiences, because obviously context matters in terms of my perspective. And I'm going to try to really emphasize that you should take the long view when applying your lens to grant writing and to, taking feedback and rejection throughout. My second piece of advice will be to get organized, and that includes knowing your audience, building a network as early as you can, and working on pilot data if possible. Finally, I'm going to get into a little bit of proposal building. And if you take anything away from today's presentation, I really hope it's understanding or being introduced to this idea of the problem statement, which to me has been such an important instrument in grant writing as well as paper writing and abstract writing. So just briefly to give you a background into myself, I did master's and PhD at Queen's University with Dr. Mike Joukowsky. This was focused on exercise physiology and brain health, generally speaking. I then had the opportunity to do a postdoc at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, focused on pediatric brain health and how the behaviors across the entire day impact brain health. I took a transition to go from a pediatric population towards metabolic syndrome and seeing how exogenous ketone supplements impact brain health in people with obesity and type 2 diabetes. And now I have the esteemed pleasure of being an assistant prof in the Department of Kin, and the director of the Exercise Brain Enhancement Lab, which I'm currently overseeing. So this is our group. Shout out to all the volunteers, undergraduate students, and master students who have been building this group. I've been here since 2020, but obviously we know something got in the way. So this is year 2 for us being in Hamilton and being a physical in-person lab. Just very briefly, just to set the context as well, we know that brain health is a continuum and it's modifiable by our daily behaviors. Things like exercise, diet, sleep, stress mitigation, and sedentary behaviors like screen time all impact the trajectory of our brain health. The goal and general focus of my research program is to understand the factors that will take this lifelong trajectory from being, say, suboptimal in this range and pushing it towards this optimized brain health range for long-term brain health and resilience, especially into aging. Outside of the lab, as I said, I'm very much into being outdoors and enjoying the natural landscape as much as possible. And this has taken me to some really neat places with my research, as well as during my downtime with friends and family. So if we look at context for grant writing and for research experience to date, I'm just going to flash on the screen a few of the funding agencies that I've had experience and success with writing applications for. Now, behind all of these images is a massive team of help and a lot of support from mentors along the way. So what I'd like to do to start off this conversation is to say that my presentation reflects my ideas and my opinions, which are fully informed by my experiences, mentors, and the research context in which I've been developing. What I would encourage at this point is for everyone involved at any point to either put your hand up, throw something in the chat, or interrupt me, because the feedback and tips that I give will either be flying in the complete opposite direction of somebody else's opinion, or there are just some other helpful tips that can be brought up as well. So at this point, I'd really encourage that kind of participation if you feel comfortable or interested. All right, so let's get into it. So if we look at the grant process, it's pretty simple, right? You get an idea, take that idea, you write it down, you build yourself a proposal, and then you just get piles of money to do your research. We know if it were this easy, we wouldn't be having these workshops and these discussions around strategies and techniques for grant writing. And I'm sure you've seen the schematic before, but there's that ideal plan that you have in your mind, a very linear process to get from where you are to your goal. But the reality is there are a number of obstacles along the way that are going to not prevent you from getting to your goal, but they're going to challenge you from getting to that point. Especially as you transition from a PhD to a postdoctoral fellowship, where fellowships are very hard to get, and it could be that iterative process. I'm sure you can really resonate with this kind of experience here. But what I'm hoping to convey from my experience is that despite all these setbacks and these challenges, if you keep your eye from where you're at to where you want to be, those challenges should be something that you can handle if you have a strong team and you have that long view. So my tip to you is to always take the long view when possible. And to start, I'd like to give you some perspective of my experience and how the long view really helped me, I think, in perspective to get to where I am right now. So I applied for the 2017 CIHR fellowship to work at the UBC Okanagan. I thought I had a really strong application. I had a really strong team with me. But then when I received my feedback, I didn't score that well. So only 28 applications were funded, but I ranked 107 out of 187. And so this took a massive sting. My ego was hurt, but also I was just having trouble wrapping my head around how harsh this was reviewed in my mind. But what I had the perspective of from my mentors and after the sting kind of subsided was that the reviewer comments were actually really strong and really helpful. So we're able to take those reviewer comments, package them up into subsequent applications, and have better success. So I put in for a second fellowship in 2018, and lo and behold, my score vastly improved. So from 107 to 27. But as you see, this was still not approved. So at this competition year, 26 of 168 applicants were permitted to have funding, and I just missed the cutoff. So that was a pretty big sting. But finally, in 2019, incorporating all this reviewer feedback and also working on myself throughout this time, I was able to vastly improve my score and receive the funding. But wouldn't you know it, I received a job at McMaster at that time, so I wasn't able to take this funding up. But I think the takeaway here is that you have growth through rejection, but it's also growth through iteration. So while the reviewer feedback can really sting, I think it's gold, and it's something that you should always be working to take in and to improve yourself with. So reviewer feedback is going to highlight the areas in either your CV, your proposal, or just your ideas that need attention. This could include things like feasibility of your project, the details that you include that you think are relevant versus what a reviewer wants to see. There could be need for pilot data, maybe not in the fellowship application, but certainly for your project grants as you become an independent researcher. When you receive your feedback and the time between applying for the next grant cycle, you can use this information to strategically work on the things that you need to work on. So an example in this case was that there was no evidence that I had the experience and the expertise to work within the field I wanted to work in. So during that year between application cycles, I made it a strong point to really hone in on those areas that they were highlighting. And finally, this is especially relevant for postdoctoral funding, but then also grants as you start building your independent lab. And that is not to put all of your eggs in one basket. So as you know, there are multiple opportunities, and at risk of spreading yourself too thin, putting these opportunities out there and seeing what comes back is not only going to give you a better chance of success, but you'll continually get feedback on your ideas, which I believe is instrumental to having that successful, strong grant down the road. And I'd just like to say as well that as this 3-year saga of CIHR back and forth was happening, I was able to repackage this idea to a BC specific funding agency, and I was successful with my funding using that reviewer feedback from CIHR. So it's not all in vain, and even if it stings, it'll help you out. So that's my perspective on taking the long view. Now, if you're approaching a grant, what are my tips for you getting started and getting to work? So getting organized is number one. I think reading through the grant instructions ad nauseum is probably required, so you can really hone in on the strategic things that you need to talk about and what's required of that grant. From a very early position, you should be connecting with mentors and looking for all the institutional support that you can get. Depending on the grant, so if applicable, you should be identifying and assembling your team to undertake this project, collecting pilot data if applicable, and giving yourself lots of time for some of these other factors like signatures and approvals that you would never think that you need to do that have to be done before your grant is submitted. So let's start with the read. So if I can just take a moment to pause and get people in the chat right now, but can you maybe give me a sense of what grant types exist? So based on your experience, what are the different types of grants that you could apply for? I would say not specific to an agency, but just grant types. So I'd be saying project grants, absolutely. Catalyst, seed grants, equipment, infrastructure, meeting grants, pilot feasibility. Yeah, these are all really good examples. Just make sure my microphone's unmuted. Yeah, okay. So here's what I came up with. And of course, there's a lot more than just this, but you have a whole variety of grants from project to infrastructure. You can have personnel awards, which are going to support you as a researcher to just focus on research. And sometimes they'll actually buy you out of teaching. So those are quite lucrative if you want to get into a research only position. There's travel, industry partnership as well. Now, each of these approaches is going to have different requirements, and therefore it's going to necessitate a different strategic approach when you're writing the grant. Most grant applications have a really detailed explanation of what they're looking for, but understanding and reading as much as you can is going to help you strategically approach what your context of your project is and what you should focus on. One quick example is the CFI infrastructure grant. So this gives you an allotment to buy equipment for your developing lab. It is a very convoluted process that requires getting quotes and connecting with different businesses to put together a list of equipment that you need. And it's a very messy process. So having the supports and also understanding what's needed is critical for success for these grants. Another thing that you should be considering as well when you're reading through is what the assessment criteria are for your specific grant. What I'm flashing on the screen right now is the almighty rubric that is associated with the NSERC Discovery Grant. And if you go to those NSERC Discovery Grant meetings, or if you speak to a mentor, they will just hammer home the importance of working the rubric. So you'll have reviewers assessing you on all of these facets and putting you into these categories. So if your proposal does not align with these indicators, you're going to miss the mark. So I highly recommend becoming familiar with these as well. So beyond just reading, having that experience and that support from people who have experience is critical to your success. So I highly recommend, as you get started on a grant, is to lean into your community and identify mentors. I think it's really helpful to understand or to find people who have experience in the content that you're proposing, but then also finding people who are non-content experts, but have experience working or submitting to the granting agency. So in both cases, an expert and a non-expert will have experience getting reviewer feedback, being reviewers themselves, and knowing exactly what it takes to make a strong application, as well as applications that fall short of getting funded. Beyond your own network, most institutions have very strong research support. At MAC, we have a real amazing contingent of dedicated research officers who will support you throughout. So at MAC, Rhodes, Milo, and HRS will help to review your grant content, as well as provide you with that important nuance of what these grants require and making sure that your formatting aligns perfectly with it. I'm not sure if any of the faculty in the room have experience with this, but I was fortunate to be on a grant where we actually paid an external reviewer to review the grant for us. This is somebody with experience who gave us very strong feedback. Obviously, you need the money for that, but it was quite valuable to land a CIHR grant that I was a part of. So aside from your mentors, if you're doing a project grant specifically, you're going to want to identify a strong team. So of course, you're not an island and you can't do all of these things on your own, especially if it's a big project. So you're going to want to find people who can address and satisfy all aspects of your proposed project. So you're going to want to have folks who are experts in outcome assessment. You're going to need to have personnel who can actually lead the project, whether that be graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, or research staff. Having people who are experts in statistics or trial design or methodologists, I think are critical, especially for any kind of interventional study. A lot of these grants are going to be assessed on feasibility, and your trial design and your power analysis will be greatly informed by somebody with experience in this facet. And then not to be forgotten as well is reaching out to community partners and setting those roots as early as you can. This is important for both participant recruitment and for knowledge transfer and exchange activities down the road. One thing that maybe you don't have experience with, but you'll find out very quickly, is that when you include your team in your grant application, it's very strong to have letters of support from these people. So it's not enough just to put someone's name in your grant saying they're going to help out with this, but to have a letter of support indicating this person's credentials, their expertise, and as well their intention to work with you is a very important step. And in some cases, it's required. And then finally, I would say having pilot data can be a really important thing, especially as an early career researcher. So sometimes your pilot data is going to support the proposal that or hypotheses that you're proposing. For an early career researcher, it'll show some critical advancements in your lab space. So for example, I've been in my lab for 2 years now, but our research program is just starting to move because of COVID. If we can display pilot work and stuff that we're doing that hasn't been published yet, at least we're demonstrating some work in progress and expertise. So I just want to flash an example here of some pilot data that I included in a recent grant. I don't expect you to understand what's on the screen or what's being demonstrated. But what I'm trying to show you is that with an N of 4, we're able to put together some figures that we're showing that over time, we're seeing a reduction in our main outcome, which was brain blood flow, and that this was related to some physiological anchors. I'm sure that having more individuals would have strengthened this relationship, but I do believe that this is enough to at least start a conversation around the need to look at our hypotheses further and to continue probing these questions of interest. So this is probably context specific and field specific, and speaking to your mentors will be very helpful for this too. Okay, so if it feels like in this section, we just bounced all over the place, this is kind of what it feels like when you're running a lab, but also when you're writing a grant. You have 8 or 9 different plates you have to spin at the same time, or balls you have to juggle at the same time. And getting organized early is going to be critical to making sure all of these factors are being dealt with in a timely manner. We know that the time of our collaborators is always limited. And so having a discussion early will allow them to be engaged at an early time point, but it also might lead to new important collaborations that you didn't consider in speaking with these people. Getting feedback on your ideas as soon as possible is super important. I'm sure people in the room can relate to having an idea that they wrestle with for weeks on end, and then they get feedback from a mentor or a supervisor, and with one comment, they either solve your issue or they break it down completely. So instead of being stuck in your head and in your ideas for a long period of time, solicit that feedback early to get on track. And then, as I said, institutional signatures, get that done early so it's not a last minute stress for everybody involved. Okay, so I'll take this moment to take a break and try to engage again. So I'd like to just brainstorm, what do you think makes a good grant application, or what are reviewers looking for? So you can put your hand up and speak on the mic, or put your ideas in the chat, and we'll take it up in a minute.
Hi, Jeremy. It's Ada.
Hey, Ada, how are you?
Hi, good. I thought I'd unmute and show my face because I know sometimes it's hard when you're presenting. Thanks for your tips. I'm here to learn from an early career researcher too.
Yeah, no problem. I'm curious to see what your takeaway will be.
I think a lot of the things that you've been saying and sharing so far are certainly on point. Getting organized, starting early, those cannot be underestimated enough, because it's very much going through with a fine-tooth comb, what's required for the grant. But in terms of making a good grant application, I agree with, what Jenny's put in, like a sellable idea, something that's really going to capture the imagination and the interest of the reviewers, is really important. And so, as much as we talk about the strength of the science and make sure it's very rigorous, it also has to be very, it has to have a hook, right? So how are you going to engage the reviewer right from the very first sentences of your grant, and help them, be engaged to keep reading.
Yeah, and that's very important too, that you're weaving that thread throughout. So you have the hook, but you're able to maintain and remind that person at every step why this matters and why they should care. So Jenny, yeah, you're saying a sellable idea, something feasible, absolutely, concision or being concise and clarity. So Ada, maybe to your point, or I could put out there to somebody else, but how do you achieve that? So do you have strategies for how you make sure there's that hook, but it's maintained throughout?
Yeah, and I am interested in hearing what other people think as well. I think, we will talk about our condition. So our condition of interest typically is stroke in our lab. So why is stroke such a major health condition, and why do we want to reduce the burden of stroke? But what's the gap that we want to fill? And so, when we look at exercise and we think that exercise is important, sometimes that's not enough, because a lot of people will say, yeah, but we know that exercise is important. So what more can you tell us through your research? So we can't just say, well, exercise, is beneficial for this, this, and this, right? What's the angle? What's the spin? So a couple of our more recent successful grants have been, for example, one where we're talking about, it impacts both heart health and brain health together. And that really hasn't been looked at. Maybe individual trials have looked at cardiovascular health and others have looked at cerebral vascular health, but how can we put those things together? And I think that was, I think that was a really important hook for our reviewers. And then another one that we've had more recent success with, I think COVID was timely because it was a tele-rehab study, but we also spun it, beyond just virtual assessments and virtual interventions and virtual interaction. It was kind of combined with, the need for COVID and the lack of in-person care that's available through hospitals, but also in hospitals, even before COVID, was shrinking lengths of stay and patients being discharged with ongoing rehab needs that weren't going to be met through the hospital. So virtual was going to help, be an opportunity to extend rehab beyond the hospital walls. So
Yeah, thanks for
those are
that.
a couple of examples.
And you raised a good point too about maybe the moment presents itself to have an audience that wants to listen. So, you're talking about extending stay or extending rehab, but shortening stay. Well, this comfort and transition towards a virtual implementation of therapy or communication might be the chance for reviewers to actually say, hey, this is easy, feasible, and it's important. And same with the brain-heart connection, or heart-brain connection. That's the Heart and Stroke's big position statement right now. And so you can strike while the iron's hot, because there's a call for that work. Independent of its novelty, it's going to be having a lot more of an audience at that point too. And Audrey's saying identifying a clear gap, which Ada also hit on too. So I think defining your problem and being able to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and we have the solution for that, which I'm going to get to with the problem statement, but I really appreciate all this feedback as well. Is there anything else before I move on? Okay, well, thank you for that. So just to summarize very briefly, when I was thinking about this, the main components I think that make up a good grant application are going to be really communicating that novelty as well as the significance of your project. So how is this new, but also why does it matter and why should we care? Obviously, our methodology is critical. So it's one thing to have novelty, but is our design going to be able to effectively answer our research question with the funds and with the personnel that we have allocated to it? And then the critical component, which Jenny, I appreciate your feedback on this, but feasibility for the scope of your project, for the personnel, and as well for answering this question with enough power in your sample size to detect a relevant change. So how do you achieve this? Here are a few thoughts from me. Clarity of writing is critical, and I believe that Sophia said this. Having logical flow. So maybe back to Ada's point about having that hook. You want people to understand where we started and how we got to the objectives and purpose of the grant. We can get quite in the weeds a bit with our jargon and with our science-specific speak, but good, strong communication allows you to clearly connect ideas and have that logic clear throughout. Using consistency of terminology, so not using synonyms, having the same terminology, so maybe a non-expert reviewer is not confused as they're reading your proposal. Selling yourself, so why are you the person who should be doing this, and how is your team poised to do this well? And then finally, establishing a clear timeline that is in line with the grant's time funding period. So before we get into the writing component, I'm just going to touch on a few aspects of feasibility, and then we'll get into the problem statement design. So feasibility is probably one of the most critical pieces of a successful grant. You can have a really well-written proposal, but if you're proposing a project that is not feasible, it's unlikely to get funded. It's one thing if you assume that you're addressing feasibility and it's clear that you have a very established timeline. But my advice is that you should be absolutely direct when you address feasibility. To me, the main components include scope and timeline, resources, personnel, and expertise, and your methodological design and power analyses. So in your grant, when you're discussing these different aspects, you should be explicit about this is feasible because. There are a number of different ways to word this and different approaches. If I could give one example, say you measure brain blood flow with duplex ultrasound. I would be discussing what my interclass correlation coefficient is, as well as my coefficient of variation for repeated date measures, and saying that our group has very low variance in our measure and we have strong repeatability, especially if that is a criticism of the instrument that you're using. So I'd encourage you to reflect on what instrument do you use, how do you reduce and account for variation, and then really expressing that and explaining it when you're discussing your methodological approach. In that same vein, when we're talking about scope and timeline of our study, it's important to be as explicit and direct as possible. So one of the tools that I like to use, and I'm sure you've heard of this from other people as well, is the Gantt chart approach. So as you know, in your proposal, you will discuss timeline and flow, but typically you won't have the space to really get into big detail for this. So what I'm showing on the screen right now is an example of a Gantt chart in a recent grant that I put in. And I've broken it down based on different aims of the study. Through this, what I'm hoping to establish is that we currently have progress underway that is leading to this project being feasible and ready to roll on day one of funding, but as well that our proposed approach to conducting the study can happen within that time frame that is allotted for this grant application. What I also find as well, and maybe others have experience with this, but when I'm making my Gantt chart, I start having to rethink my strategical approach. So I need to start thinking, maybe I'm being too big, or maybe I could be a bit more ambitious because I have enough time or I don't have enough resources. So this could be something that you do early and often to kind of check in to see if your ideas fit within a reasonable time frame. The other part of feasibility, I think, is the art of selling yourself. So I'm really curious to get, especially from the junior trainees here, but how do you go about selling yourself? And even for Ada or the other faculty as well, it's probably one of the most uncomfortable things to having to be talking about how great you are and sell yourself. So what are some strategies to make that effective and also not make it so cringy?
I'll kick things off just quickly to say, I started off writing a lot of we've done this and we've done this, and I was told just write I, especially when you're writing for personnel awards or scholarships. It's super uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the people want to see that you are the leader and you can be very direct in leading this team. Okay, Jenny. So Jenny's saying positioning yourself based on your technical experience and uniqueness of what you've been doing. I think that's a really strong point, Jenny. You kind of getting away from how good I am to here's my experience and here's evidence of the times I've been successful with it and why I can continue to do this in a feasible way. So here's some of the ideas that I had, and I think it's in line with both Ada and Jenny. So providing evidence of your experience and your proficiencies. You can also use what's called brag metrics, and I learned this word from a postdoc mentor of mine. But sometimes you do have to sell yourself on your productivity. And I actually like to get your take on this, Ada, how you feel about having to be spoon feeding someone your publication numbers and citations, but I've been told that this is actually important.
I do put it.
Mhm.
I think one of the things that as a grant community, we're trying to get away from those hard metrics, or a lot of times, as a grant reviewer myself, I've been told not necessarily to put all of your review on those hard metrics, because there's a lot of different reasons why somebody's H index or their impact factors of the journals that they publish in may not be as high, and we want to be looking at applicants as as holistic as possible. Having said that, there's still a lot of people who do put a lot of emphasis on, oh, they have this many publications and these high impact journals. So I think we're at this transition point now where those hard metrics are important, but it's also important to sell yourself beyond those.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I found, and maybe you found this too, but when you see your reviewer feedback, they almost parrot back to you what you wrote about yourself for the hard metrics. They will say like, so-and-so is an early career researcher with X number of publications, and they kind of use that as their jump off point for your excellence as a researcher. So it should be included. But as Jenny said, and as Ada said as well, your experience and the things you're working on are also critical from a feasibility perspective to sell. I would also look further than yourself and consider your institution. So what is it about your support and your infrastructure that will make you different from the next person, but also will set you up to do this in a successful, feasible manner? And then as well, I think knowledge transfer and exchange goes a long way. I've always had that as a key component when speaking about my experience. And it's always come back very positive. I think that open access and that model towards scientific communication is becoming more and more important. So seeking these opportunities out, but speaking about them as well will be critical. Okay, so this is feasibility. Now I'm going to get into the last part of this talk, which is the problem statement approach. And I know I can't really see a show of hands here, but maybe you've learned about this, maybe you haven't. But I absolutely love how simple and effective this approach is. And so I just want to acknowledge what Ada said in the chat, and that is especially looking to your resources and to your connections with your institution. Talking about links to institutions like MIRA is absolutely great. So you have an entire institute that's focused on aging research, and there'll be a massive resource to ensure that you can do this work, and they're connected with community partners. Okay, so for writing an effective proposal, the problem statement I teach to third year students, fourth year, my graduate students, and I use this every single time I start a new project because I find it is such an effective way to organize thoughts. This was an approach that I learned from my mentors at Queen's University, Dr. Brendan Gerd and Dr. Mike Chakosky. And this simplistic but effective approach allows you to go from this general knowledge of what we know, contextualize it, and really identify what the problem is that we're trying to solve. I think this is what Audrey said in the chat as well, that identifying a knowledge gap or a problem is critical to saying why this research needs to be done. And basically what a problem statement is just 5 simple statements that anchor all of your ideas for your entire grant. It also is a really strong structure for establishing a logical flow of your ideas. So every statement that you make should be connected to the subsequent statement, and a reviewer should clearly see how these ideas connect in a very logical fashion. Importantly, the ideas that you present in your background through the problem statement are going to set the context for what methods you use and what outcomes you assess. So you can really simplistically spoon feed somebody what you're going to address, and they should already know why it's important that you're addressing this. And finally, if you do a good job of identifying a problem and identifying a solution, you should really be justifying why your research is so important. So this is a little flow chart that we show third and fourth year students about the typical process of doing research. And if you just briefly scan over it, you'll see that up to number 8 is pretty much the entire grant writing process. So you're defining your problem, you're choosing your study design, your hypotheses, you're identifying your participants to be involved. Through all of this, you are basically setting the context for what's to come. And what you really want to do as you set this up is give the reader that hook so they understand exactly why we need to do it. So through a problem statement, you should be telling somebody, what do we know already? What do we not know? What's the reason for this knowledge gap? What's a solution to find out? And why is this important? I think if you're able to convincingly give a reader this information, you should be telling them why your study is fundable and why it's important. I'll just say as I go through the next couple of slides, if you want this presentation or if you want a presentation of the problem statement on its own, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to provide you with those resources. So very briefly, the components of the problem statement, as I said, are these 5 anchors that set up your entire proposal. The first anchor is called the principal proposition. And this is a general statement that tells people what we already know, and it sets the context within which our research is going to exist. Then we have what's called the interacting proposition, or what we call the problem. So we're telling people what we already know, and now we're going to give them a statement that says, here's a problem that contradicts or challenges what we know already. After we set the problem, we're going to use something called the speculative proposition, which essentially is our hypothesis that proposes a solution to everything that comes next. So this proposition here is essentially a summary of how we plan to solve the issue and to run this research. And then obviously we have our statement of purpose. So we're specifying our direction and our objectives, as well as hypothesis. And finally, we're explaining to somebody what is to be gained from this approach. Now, if you can visualize this as the introduction or the background of your entire grant, you should be able to see clear logical flow between the general knowledge of what's accepted and what we know to what our problem is, to how we can address that and why it's important. I think if you take a piece of paper and just write this out ahead of time in these 5 statements, you can start to fill in the gaps of your research problem and to really make sure that your ideas connect logically. So let me give you an example of what this could look like with an example. So Dr. Gerd said all it takes is 3 beautiful paragraphs, and really you can make this into as many as you want. So the first paragraph, we're going to use a principal proposition. We're going to have evidence to support this idea, and then we're going to give the reader our problem. In the second paragraph or third, we're then going to basically hypothesize how we can solve this problem. This is your mechanism. This is the meat and potatoes of what you're going for in your grant. And then as a summary sentence, you basically give somebody your statement of how you plan to address the issue. And then in the third paragraph, you're going to give people your objectives and your hypothesis. So let me give you an example. It's very simple. It's not really scientifically correct, but I think you can see the logical flow in this example that I'll provide. So imagine our principal proposition, and this is generally accepted on the whole, is that smoking causes lung cancer. I could start off my paragraph saying that, and then provide all the evidence to support this statement. Then I would provide people with the however, or the question of the problem that we're trying to solve. So smoking causes lung cancer. However, there are people who smoke that do not develop cancer. So this is kind of conflicting evidence or an equivocal exception where despite this connection being clear, some people do not develop it. So what could the reason be? And this is where we speculate as to why we think this relationship is uncoupled in this situation. So the proposition could be regular aerobic exercise may reduce inflammation and prevent lung cancer in smokers. So essentially what we're doing is building a hypothesis. And you can see in red, I've highlighted reduce inflammation. Through this, we're able to essentially build the key variables that we're going to address in our study, and also build out the methodological approach that could most optimally address this question. And then very simply, your objective and hypothesis is going to reflect and repeat what was written in your speculative hypothesis, and really get specific in terms of how you plan to approach this. And of course, the significance will be telling people why this question needs to be answered. I don't know if there's other approaches or other thoughts to writing a proposal, but this is how I go about it. I'll pause here and just ask if anybody has other approaches or similar approaches to writing their proposal. Jenny, I know your group does this in VDL with Maureen as well. All right, we got a strong capital, love this method. Ada, do you use something similar to this, or do something different?
No, we've been exposed to this through the VDL as well. And I think it's a very good way of logically thinking through your question leading to the methods. And so when it comes to grant writing, like to tie it back to grant writing, you want to take somebody who doesn't know what you're thinking or is as familiar with the research. You want to take them through that same logical flow. And so using this problem statement can help with that.
Great, thanks. Audrey, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, this won't apply to all grants, but in a lot of mirrors granting and others, the integration of stakeholders or end users and who's going to actually implement what you find is really useful. And so sometimes it only comes at the beginning. People say, well, we'll talk to the stakeholders and then we'll never think about them again. And then other times it's only at the end. And then when we're done, we'll tell a pharmaceutical company what we found or something. But the strongest proposals sort of are really clear about who they are at the beginning, and they're going to consult with them and maybe also let that influence like what they think the problem is, and then revisit that at the end and how they're going to sort of, implement their findings. And so not all funding programs require that, but those that do, my advice would be to even take it even further and weave it throughout if it makes sense, right? If you can make a case that those stakeholders can be engaged in different phases of all of these.
Absolutely. And I think you might even hit on the tokenism, where sometimes people just have it as a checkbox saying, we will engage or we'll disseminate our findings, but there's no plan and there's no evidence that that's actually going to be implemented. So I appreciate that approach, and it's not one I'd ever taken before in terms of weaving it in throughout my proposal. It usually does come at the end, even if it's in earnest, it's not integrated. That's great. So I'm going to throw it out there. If you've never done this before, at least try it. Email me and I'll send you maybe a document of how I go about setting it up. But it was a watershed moment for me, because for abstract writing, award writing, grants, papers, it all kind of flows through this very basic structure of logic. And it might have you kind of rethinking your ideas, but at least you do it in a way where it's just 5 sentences versus 5 pages of ideas they have to rewrite. So just to summarize this, some take-home points is that I think the problem statements are effective. They convey the importance of your work. They really focus your introduction. They provide that logic and that structure that I think provides clarity for any reviewer to follow and to pick up on. I'm sure you talked about this in other seminars, but you can use these as anchors, either as subheadings or as emphasis points that you emphasize within your text. And so you're really spoon feeding somebody what they should be taking away from the end of a paragraph or what they should be looking for when they start reading your paragraph. And if you can guide somebody towards where you're going with these emphasis points, I think you'll have more success of making your message clear and understood. And just one thing to put out there, you're not going to save the world with one study. You're not going to solve all the world's problems with one study. So at risk of sounding maybe a little bit, trying to undersell a bit, you don't need to over justify the importance. If you provide clear logic and you establish a problem exists, the necessity of your study to run and be funded should be clear without you having to go over and above what you're actually going to achieve. So just keep that in mind. I think that this is incremental and progressive as you work through your research career. Okay, so I just want to close off my talk with this last slide. I asked my friend and postdoctoral fellow in our lab, Dr. Jeff Coombs, to give me some of his tips from grant writing. So we recently were successful for an Alzheimer's Society grant from the local Alzheimer's Society, as well as he supported for a postdoc funding through MIRA. So Jeff would be the best position, I think, to give a fresh perspective on what works well. So he said, the big picture is important, and you have to go beyond that granular scientific jargon that is very field specific. So sell your idea. Proposals need to flow well. And he's saying what we just said earlier about emphasis needing to jump off the page. So capture your audience's attention and keep them hooked. Getting feedback from experienced individuals is critical, and it's going to help you along your path. And this is one piece that I didn't mention yet, and that's the more you see, the more you learn. So if you have a chance to ask for a copy of a grant from a mentor, which they'd be more than happy to do, or to review scholarships for different institutions like MIRA, you can start to differentiate between the strong proposals and the ones that need some work. And maybe in doing so, it's going to improve your grant writing as you go forward. So with that, I'd just like to wrap up and thank you for your attention and for your engagement. And I know there's only 5 minutes left, but I'd be happy to take questions if there are any.
I have a question. I can't figure out how to raise my hand in Zoom. Sorry, not a question, a comment. I would just say that this is something that I learned from reading some of Kenny Noguchi's grant applications, that he likes to bold some terms, and he uses white space. And that's very helpful for the reader, that if there's not an overwhelming amount of text, and like use of subheadings, if there's enough space, or just bolding to emphasize some concepts can be very helpful, at least for me as a reviewer. Absolutely. And yeah, the white space is critical. So having your ideas in those paragraphs, but not making it just an ongoing paragraph of 5 pages. One thing I would say about using emphasis, so bold, italics, or underlining, is that you should be consistent with what that means. I think in some of my first grant iterations, I was bolding, underlining, just everything was important. And the feedback I got was like, I don't know what's important, and I don't know what this means. So maybe you underline key points, or you're going to bold like important factors, but that approach should be consistent throughout, and you shouldn't be changing up what that means halfway down the page. But it's a really good point.
I also enjoyed your plug for agreeing to review things that MIRA asks you to review. That's good experience, and we appreciate it very much.
Does MIRA use a rubric? Like, do you have a set criteria?
Yeah.
We do, and we started sharing that rubric with applicants, because sometimes I felt that there were applicants that may have hit the right boxes if they knew what they were. So makes it a little harder if you don't know what you're aiming for.
And could I ask Mira, like, when you come to being interdisciplinary and integrative, how like do you evaluate that? What would be like the criteria for this being truly integrative versus we have a couple applicants from different departments that are on the same grant?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we do, we have a section where we ask people to be really detailed about how the interdisciplinary team is going to benefit this grant, right? So not just list the people, but tell us why it's so important that all of the people you've listed are involved. And then there is also, in some cases, an ask for a little bit more details about how they're going to work together. So beyond saying, we're going to have a meeting once a month, they might say, this person is going to inform this stakeholder consultation or qualitative interviews, and then we'll take that and then it will inform phase 2. So like really specific about what each person's going to do and why that is critical to the entire project. What else? See, we're in the same room. Can you tell we're like
I like to see that it's not an afterthought. So I'd like to see it throughout the application. We also don't have limits on letters. So I've seen in a recent grant application that every single person that said they were collaborating wrote a letter explaining exactly how they would do that. And I also want to see that it's collaborating and not a division of labor, like you will do this part. Like seeing 5 different silos is still upsetting to me. I would like to see everyone working together from start to finish if possible.
Yeah, I think having those support letters is critical. But those conversations early is really what allows you to be earnest and strategic and not just an afterthought saying, okay, here's what you do, here's what I do, and we'll just throw it on the grant in different places.
We can tell.
Good to know.
This has been a really wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Audrey, do you have any final comments? Thanks, everyone. And I'm looking forward to reading your mock grant applications.
Thanks so much for the opportunity and for everyone's attention.